So if you wonder what does that leave us with then, with the RSV, well, it leaves us with a series of later editions of the RSV. It has not, in other words, remained consistent. The text of the RSV has not remained consistent over the years because of new printings or because of new editions which give us new wording. And so I want to look at 4 or 5 of those later editions of the RSV and see some of the changes which have occurred. The first one we'll start with, number 1 this morning, will be simply the 1952 whole, that is complete, RSV. Now that's not a later edition as such, generally not thought of that, not thought to be that, because that's the actual date for the original publication of the complete RSV. But you may recall that the New Testament had come out some years earlier. The New Testament had actually come out just after the conclusion of the Second World War in 1946. The entire Bible is ready in 1952. Well, in those 6 years, the translators had had that much time to think about some of their translations. So what's interesting is the RSV New Testament, the original one of 1946, is not the same as what we end up with as the accepted RSV in 1952. Remember, it's not until 52 that we have an Old Testament. There's no Old Testament done in 46. But we've got one type of New Testament in 46, and then we have some revision of that. Some of it's better, some of it's worse, when we go from the 1946 single New Testament to the 1952 whole RSV. Now I'm just going to note a few of these changes. There were many changes. The vast majority of them were minor and of little consequence. I'm only going to give you 3 that are a little more important and 3 that are of more consequence than various spellings and just the way they chose to translate words and so forth. So here under our first edition, we'll call it an edition, here would be the first example that I would give you. Their inconsistency and confusion over the terms sanctify and consecrate. Sanctify or sanctification and consecrate or consecration. In other words, what we're going to be discussing here under our first edition will be differences between the 1946 RSV New Testament and the 1952 RSV New Testament. I'm assuming that those of you who have your RSV with you will have, obviously, a 1952 or later. There are other editions of the New Testament, second major one in 1971, but you'll have something that's based on some of the later work of revision. So you're probably not going to find the things I'm talking about in the 1946. But you can still look in whatever RSV you have, and you'll see the change that has occurred when I explain it to you. Sanctify and consecrate. Sanctify is the KJV word. Sanctify is the older term. But sanctify is the less understood, obviously. You have to explain sanctify. Generally, you don't have to explain consecrate. They're both not common terms in English, to be sure. But I think more people would understand what the term consecrate or consecration means in sanctity, sanctification, sanctify, or anything on that order. And so, as a result, the original 1946 New Testament gave us the word consecrate throughout the New Testament, which is probably the thing to do. It's simply a better understood term. Too often in people's minds, they think of sanctification, sanctify, sanctity, in some type of relation with saint. Although they're not the same terms, they don't come from the same terms, they sound the same, they start with an S and so forth, and they know that a saint's a holy person, and so anything that has to do with sanctify or sanctification has something to do with holiness. And that's not necessarily true. Then you'd have to go on to define holiness, of course, to be sure. But the original RSV New Testament gave us consecrate throughout the New Testament, hoping thereby to explain what the term consecrate or consecration really meant. But when the entire Bible came out in 1952, they reversed their decision for some strange reason and went back to the old term, sanctify and sanctification. When I say for some strange reason, the reason probably being that although consecrate and consecration are a little easier to understand, sanctify and sanctification are, quote, Bible theological terms, unquote. That is, these are religious terms. This is accepted religious terminology now, sanctify and sanctification. And the RSV has, enough problems being called a red Bible, a red scare-produced Bible, and so forth. So I guess they thought they would get out of any criticism that was unnecessary. So they changed the color of their Bible, and they changed consecrate back to sanctify. But they do have a curious omission if you'll turn to John 17, verses 17 to 19. This is an unusual place, and why they did this, I don't really know. You see, they came out with consecrate first. They changed it all back to sanctify, with the exception of some verses in John 17. And you have the curious omission of leaving the term consecrate from the original 1946 here in this passage. You're not only leaving that, but mixing it with the new term of sanctify. John 17, verses 17 to 19. Now this is their new reading. This should be the 1952 and afterward reading. Sanctify them in the truth. Thy word is truth. Now that's okay if you're going to choose sanctify. Just make it consistent throughout the New Testament. And they did in the 1952 edition, with the exception of this passage, whereas the 1946 had given us consecrate without exception to the New Testament. As thou didst send me into the world, so have I sent them into the world, and for their sake I consecrate myself. Same term in the Greek. That they also may be consecrated in truth. And you just said in verse 17, sanctify them in the truth. Now you're saying consecrate them in the truth. So here, for some reason, you have a curious omission, a curious carryover of the 1946 predilection toward the use of the term consecrate or consecration. So there's one difference. Not a major difference. I don't really care what term you choose, but I find it a little inconsistent. And that just between three verses, 17, 18, and 19, to give us the confusion of sanctify and then consecrate. And the second thing I'd have to say about the 1952 concerns the footnote on Matthew 1:16. You can turn in your Bible, Matthew 1:16. The 1946 New Testament had followed Moffat's text in their footnote, saying of Joseph that he was the father of Jesus, who is called Christ. You may recall me saying that about Moffat's reading here. That follows an extremely dubious variant. Of course, it is an expression of Christological liberalism, saying that Joseph is the father of Christ. That's never said by any of the writers of the New Testament. Now, some of the Jews say that we know your father Joseph, but they misunderstood the matter. But Matthew would know the issue. Matthew goes on to talk about, in verse 23, a virgin shall conceive, so Joseph could hardly be the father. I think it's striking at the root of a part of biblical Christianity, namely the virgin birth. So the 1946 New Testament follows Moffat's text in their footnote. Now, it was a footnote, not in the reading of the text itself, saying that Joseph was the father of Jesus, who is called Christ. The 1952 Bible happily goes back to what they should have, the correct reading of the KJV. Let's take a look at verse 16. Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom, the same reading as the KJV has, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. And notice if you've got an RSV with notes, footnotes there, you have no footnote. that tries to correct that. So on the first point, sanctify, consecrate, the 1946 New Testament was better. The 1952 worse. On the second one, a footnote on Matthew 1:16, the 1946 was worse. The 1952 was better. Then one final illustration on the comparison of the two early RSV New Testaments would be over in 1 Timothy. 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 2. Here we go back to favoring the 1946. You see, we just don't know. They're not consistent, and sometimes they've improved something, and sometimes they've made it worse in the 1952 edition, which is what you're going to be stuck with unless we've got later revisions that even correct some earlier things of the 52, which of course we do. But it's not going to correct these three things. 1 Timothy 3:2. And it concerns this phrase that's translated in the KJV, the husband of one wife. The husband of one wife. Now there's a lot of debate as to what that means. The husband of one wife. One of the conditions for the pastorate or for an elder or bishop. The husband of one wife. Does it mean one at a time? Does it mean that he can only be married once, that divorced people are disqualified from the ministry, even if they were married, divorced, remarried back in their unsaved days? Does the Greek not really have anything to say about a wife so much? What it's talking about is faithfulness in marriage. That is, it is a statement against infidelity or adultery or something on that order. Well, the 1946 RSV translated the Greek as plainly and strongly as possible, as follows: married only once. Now that's not ambiguous at all. We know exactly what that means, married only once. Husband of one wife doesn't really tell you anything. That leaves the door open for several different interpretations. And that, by the way, is why most translations have followed a reading similar to that, the husband of one wife, because that does leave it open to interpretation. You can't fault the interpreters or the translators of the Bible for being interpreters and saying what the RSV has said, married only once, because we know what that means. You've given us one of several options for interpretation of the passage. The 1952 RSV comes right along and tones that down, reads just like the KJV. A bishop must be above reproach, the husband of one wife. The Greek might literally be translated, you often hear this, a one-woman man. But that is a little ambiguous as well. Does it mean one woman at a time? Could you have been married 4 times earlier, perhaps in lost days, perhaps in saved days, but you only got one now? You're a one-woman man. Or is this an expression carrying the nuance of faithfulness or fidelity in marriage? A one-woman man. You're satisfied with the one woman that you have. You're not looking outside of marriage. So it'd be a verse against adultery or infidelity. But even taking the Greek, one-woman man, you've still got to deal with the question of time. So often asked, does it mean one woman at a time? In other words, can a man in ministry be divorced? Is this verse against polygamy, or is this verse against divorce and remarriage in ministry? I think probably at the end of the day you'll have to accept one or the other of those alternatives. It either is against polygamy, and you often hear that as an interpretation, although I find that just as highly unlikely as possible. I mean, that is so obvious. That would not have to be something said here. Paul writing Timothy, now let me tell you, to be a minister you can't have 15 wives. I could hardly find that acceptable as one of the conditions. That would be understood. It's like, well, before you can be a pastor, you have to be saved. Well, that's not said here. because that's so basic and elementary and so understood, you would hardly have to say that. I think that the correct view is in the original 1946 RSV, which you just will hardly find in any translations because it's too strong. And that is a translation of the Greek as plainly and as strongly as it can be translated. He must be married only once. The KJV is not wrong, husband of one wife, because that husband of one wife means only one. But then you've got to interpret that, and you have to say, now what he meant by that is only one throughout your whole life. So you have to interpret that and say, no divorce and remarriage. The 1952 RSV, same thing, and since then, as I just read, husband of one wife, the husband of one wife, same as the KJV. Other translations do essentially the same. I just looked up the NIV, which really misses the mark. They really water it down. They have husband of one wife, but they have the word but. They throw that conjunction in there, and they say the husband of but one wife. The husband of but one wife. And what they meant by that, the translator in the NIV of 1 Timothy, the book of 1 Timothy, was that this is a prohibition against polygamy. The husband of but one wife. But emphasizes the one that follows it, the but one wife. And the translator felt but one wife at a time view. That seems to be a liberal trend in Protestantism today, to just kind of shake your head at divorce and remarriage, but it's no big deal. Shake your head, it's a naughty no-no, but it's no big issue, no big deal. But I think that it is, according to Jesus' teaching and according to Jesus' teaching about the original plan of God in the garden. Adam was to be a one-woman man, and that didn't mean one at a time. That meant one. Two shall join themselves and become one, not three or four or five. And anything, in any situation, in anyone, and I'm thinking now in biblical times, in biblical days, anyone who didn't do that sinned. Doesn't matter whether it looked like it was okay. Doesn't matter whether it looked like God is the one who gave David all of his extra wives, and many of the other people, it was still wrong. Doesn't matter whether it looks like Abraham was okay with several wives, it was wrong. That's according to Jesus' teaching in Matthew 19 on God's teaching, Moses' teaching in Genesis 2. So that's what I would have to say about a comparison and contrast of the original RSV New Testament and the more or less final one of 1952. We agree with the 46 New Testament in some regards, such as consecrate, the first example I gave you, and married only once. But then we disagree in the second case, its footnote on Matthew 1:16, which follows an extremely dubious variant. Okay, let's go on to a second edition of the RSV. This is called the 10th Year Anniversary Edition, 1962. And you see anything that you have post-1962, which is probably the RSV that you have, will not be like the 1952 RSV, the Complete Bible. It'll be like the 1962. You see, as it's an anniversary edition which has some revision in it, about 85 different changes. They're not, most of them aren't major ones, but there are about 85 changes from the 62 to the 52 edition. And what you have, if it's post-1962, will obviously incorporate these revisions. Now, one, to me, seems to stand out as important. That's over in Matthew 27, Matthew 27:54, and the parallel verse where it's also found, but we won't take the time to look it up, Mark 15:39. Matthew 27:54, Mark 15:39. We'll just take a look at the Matthew 27:54 passage. When the centurion and those who were with him, keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe and said, now this is the 1952 RSV, truly this was a Son of God. See, if you go back to this one, my red one, which is a 1952 one, you've got A in there. I'm reading from the other one just so I don't have to keep opening both of them, but I checked it and it's there. Truly this was a Son of God. Well, never fear, in our modern RSVs, although we don't have that in the text, we have it down in the footnote, though. Truly this was the, and then capital S, Son of God, footnote, or a Son, A, indefinite article, S, small s, a Son of God. Well, you can see what that's doing. Truly this was the Son of God, like this was an important man, like this was a holy man, not this was the Son of God. So it sounds too much to me, and this is again one of the many case examples that could be given, most of which we've already given, the important ones earlier, of the RSV, of liberalism. These are the things that have caused people, evangelicals and conservatives, to fear the use of the RSV. They've got all their reasons why now this is really the way that it should be translated, and regardless of whether the Greek has this or that, the Greek can't express an indefinite article except just leaving it out, and so if you put the in, you're supplying it yourself. And so they argue on that basis, and they argue on the basis of, well, what would the attitude of the centurion have been? Would he have recognized this as the Son of God? Where would he have gotten the idea? He's a Roman centurion. He's not looking for Messiah. The Son of God? Or is he just saying this is a holy man? This was a righteous man because of some of the deeds surrounding his death, his hanging on the cross. But regardless, we can't get into all of that. I think that the Son of God is the best reading here. Still, it seems like the RSV translators, at every possible occurrence, are trying to tone down the teaching of the Bible. They can't just come right out and write their own verse and say Jesus isn't the Son of God. They don't have any, support for that. But it seems to me like any place that they can find a foothold to work their devious theory of liberalism in, they do it. And they have a lot of explanations why they think this is the best reading, such as what I've just given you. The Greek doesn't have the, and so it really means a, and a centurion wouldn't have known anything about God or his Son. Maybe a Jew would have been thinking of Son of God or Messiah or Son of Man, but not a Roman centurion. But I just still find it interesting that any place that is even questionable, or any place where anybody could hold a question, immediately the RSV translators turn it into something that reads rather liberally. There are about 84 other changes from 52 to 62, but most of them are minor, insignificant. This to me stands out as the most important one of the 10th year anniversary edition.
Question,
yes.
Was there any men translating like 52 or 62? Was anybody there at the same time?
Oh yeah, a lot of the same people are there. Yeah, the same people are there. But the climate changes, times are different. Pressure is put on. If we're going to get the RSV in all of these churches out there like we want to make it a bestseller or a good-selling Bible, then people are having trouble with that A in there. Truly, this was a Son, small as a Son of God. If you want to appeal to more people, then, give us expiation so you can get the liberals, and give us the Son of God so you can get the conservatives. But they probably need to also think that, the big argument, I think, here in this passage doesn't concern the Greek at all. Because we have the many times when there's no article at all, and you have a feel for it, and you know when it should be that. It's the man, the centurion. He's a Roman. How would he have known anything about a or the Son of God, especially the Son of God, or a Son, capital S, the Son of God? Well, we could turn that around and ask that question of a Jew, though. Jews were looking for Messiah, but Messiah as the Son of God? Did they actually have, a clear Christian conception of that? So you may have a problem either way. And yet Jesus went teaching that he was the Son of God by virtue of the fact he was always talking about his what? His Father. He didn't have to say, I'm the Son of God. When you go talking about your Father, who is God, that makes you the Son of God. And where would the centurion have got the notion? Well, from all of the events surrounding the death of Christ. He would have heard things that were said and things that were preached. Perhaps he heard Jesus some other place. Perhaps he heard what the women were saying or some of the disciples that had fled. And he certainly sees what's going on right here. The rocks were split and the tombs were open and bodies of dead saints came forth walking around. I doubt you'd say, yeah, I guess this guy was probably okay. It'd come to my mind, this was God, or this was the Son of God. I wouldn't just have, a blah perception of this man that he was an okay man, or a good man, or a son of God, meaning a holy man. There's something extraordinary and supernatural about him and about his death, seen by virtue of the fact of the events surrounding the crucifixion. I have no problem at all with the centurion recognizing that this was truly the Son of God. Then a third edition of the RSV, a point you may not have known, is the Catholic Revised Standard Version of 1966. I did say earlier in our RSV studies that the RSV has been a very popular translation among mainline high church Protestant bodies, along with the Roman Catholics. Now, the Roman Catholics officially couldn't use just a normal, standard, regular RSV, but they could use one that was done especially and particularly for them. You may not have known that. You may have thought, well, they have, Jerusalem Bible or Knox's Bible or New American Bible or Westminster Bible or something like that. Well, they do. But they've also had the RSV, and it's been a very important Bible for the Roman Catholics. So let me give you a little of the background. Maybe we'll spend a little more time with this because, by the way, next Sunday morning, Lord willing, we'll be looking at Knox's translation. We'll probably spend our whole time on that, which is a very important Roman Catholic translation. So in preparation for that, we'll spend a little more time looking at the Catholic RSV this morning then. For 13 years, the Division of Christian Education of the National Council of Churches, which was that body now owning the copyright to the ASV, RSV, for 13 years, the Division of Christian Education of the National Council of Churches had worked in conjunction with the Catholic Biblical Association, generally just abbreviated CBA. But you've got CBA in different countries. You've got CBA of America, like I get their journal, the CBA Journal, American Journal, Catholic Biblical Association. But the Catholic Biblical Association of England, to produce a RCRSV. The history really goes back to October of 1959. Here in this month, in an issue of an American Roman Catholic journal entitled America, an American Roman Catholic journal entitled America, October 1959 issue. A Roman Catholic writer, Father Walter Abbott, double B, double T, Father Walter Abbott, wrote an article entitled The Bible is a Bond. The Bible is a Bond. His argument was, if we can't get together and agree on various doctrinal matters and issues, such as the authority of the Pope, the authority of tradition, the authority of the apocryphal books, and so forth, if we can't get together and agree on that, why can't we just agree on a Bible translation? That should be the bond for all Christians all over the world. We might have different views about Mary. We might have different views about church government and leadership, but why can't we agree on at least having a Bible together? He said, why is it that we can use each other's translations but refuse to cooperate in a joint venture? You see, in one sense, they were admitting the Protestants were using available Catholic translations and the Catholic the Protestant ones. So in one sense, they were admitting that each other's translations were okay, but they wouldn't admit it publicly. To admit it publicly meant you had to get the scholars of the two groups together, Protestants and Roman Catholics, and cooperate in a joint venture of translation to give us a translation that hopefully is agreeable to Roman Catholics and to Protestants. He said, and I quote, "Such would be a great achievement in the history of Christianity." It would probably be preparation for the rise of Antichrist. Such would be a great achievement in the history of Christianity. He further said this was a rather important article, and it produced the Roman Catholic RSV. He further argued that although a joint Bible would probably not help doctrinal differences, and he's certainly right there, it probably wouldn't help doctrinal differences. It might, however, in minor areas, such as, and I think he specified these two, such as the wording of the model prayer, as well as in the numbering of the Ten Commandments. Roman Catholics, you see, have an entirely different enumeration. They end up with 10, but they join 2 and separate another. So you end up with 10 in the long run. Protestants have their 10, Roman Catholics have their 10. They're all the same. I mean, it's the same thing. They haven't added in another one, an 11th one, like the Samaritans did, the Samaritan Pentateuch. They all have 10, and the 10 are the same, but the Roman Catholics join the first 2 and then split up the last one. And there's a reason why they do that. It's to tone down that business of idols and icons in the Second Commandment. If you can join the Second Commandment with the First Commandment in Exodus 20, then the first seems to predominate. And you tend not to notice what the second said, that thou shalt not make any graven image. If you start off saying, you shall have no other God before me, well, we don't have any other gods before you. We're worshiping God through the images, so we don't have any other gods. See, the first commandment is no other God. The second one is no graven image. And the Protestants, by keeping those separate, which they should be, that's the Jewish way, to keep those separate, will tend to, in that second one, when you come to it, you have nothing to emphasize but idols and idolatry and icons and images. You have nothing left to deal with. If that's not what the commandment is saying, it says nothing at all. But I'm saying if you can join it with the first one, you can kind of smooth over what is the Protestant and Jewish second one by concentrating on the first one. And then the Roman Catholics can jump down to the 10th one and split it up into 2. They know they've got to end up with 10 because the Bible talks about the 10 words, the 10 commandments. So they got to find one that will split up. And the 10th one happens to be one of the longest ones. It's the longest one in the second section of the 10 commandments, so it's appropriate to split up. I don't know how you could split up thou shalt not commit adultery, except thou shalt not be one, the next one commit adultery. But they knew that would never pass. So they go to that second one, or that last one, thou shalt not covet this and that. Your neighbor's this, your neighbor's that, your neighbor's the other. And you got so many words there, you could make that into 5 or 6 commandments. So you just understand a little bit about where people are in their heresy, and you can then kind of rearrange or reconstruct the events that led up to why they read the Bible the way that they do. So he thought it would help in these areas, model prayer, numbering of the 10 Commandments, and some other small things, although it really wouldn't help in big doctrinal areas. Roman Catholic scholars had already been working with the RSV in England. This was really an English, a British project, and not an American one. And they had noticed that with a few changes in the 1952, now 62, or later to be 62, RSV, with a few changes, perhaps several dozen, the RSV could be acceptable to them, to Roman Catholic scholars and to the Roman Catholic Church. So all of this is in print in October of 1959. Then, right around the corner, comes Second Vatican Council from 1962 to 1965. And you know what that did? That really liberalized the Roman Catholic Church, or if nothing else, it opened doors that had been closed in Roman Catholicism earlier. And Walter Abbott actually became known as the Pope's Bible ambassador. He was so zealous to have some work done in this area. So it just seemed like a real opportune time to have already written the article in October of '59 without knowing it, right around the corner. Vatican II explodes on the scene and produces all of these results, and so those things, mesh together. The climate, the atmosphere of the time is appropriate to have a joint venture, according to a lot of people. And so in 1965, the New Testament, RSV, is published. 1966, the entire Bible, and it incorporated several dozen, about 25 or so, changes in the RSV text and notes to make it congenial to Catholic thought. And this was a rather noteworthy event for the Catholics. They put the changes made in the text in an appendix for people to note. That was very, very fair to do. They took the RSV and amended it as they saw fit in several dozen places, and that concerned the text and the notes. And those where they changed the RSV Protestant text, they placed in a separate appendix for people to take note of. Now let's look at just a few of these examples. Some of them are not that important, but let's take a look at a few of these. For instance, we were in Matthew earlier. If you're still there, in Matthew 12. Verses 46 and 48. Matthew 12, 46, 48. The Protestant Bible has brothers. The RSV has brethren. Now you have to turn to the passage to see what the difference might be. You would say, well, there's really no difference. Well, in most contexts, to be sure, there'd be no difference. You talk about brothers, brethren, you mean essentially the same thing. Of course, you have to know a little bit of Roman Catholic background and theology here, which I'm sure all of you do, and you'd know why they might go from brothers to brethren. Very small, subtle change, but it carries meaning. While he, Jesus, was still speaking to the people, behold, his mother and his brothers. Well, if he's got brothers who are sons of his mother, Mary, that does not mean that Mary was a virgin all her life long then. It's a big problem with Roman Catholic theology. They teach the doctrine of the perpetual virginity of Mary. And, of course, she was not a virgin all of her life. She was a virgin when she gave birth to Jesus Christ, and she was not a virgin when she gave birth to his at least 4 brothers and 2 sisters. Now, when you say brethren, brethren is kind of that general term. We can call each other brethren and not be related by blood, that is. Now, I know we can call each other brothers and sisters and not be related by blood, but still, brothers and sisters, I hope you can see this, those are stronger terms than brethren. Brethren's a much weaker term. It just speaks of, perhaps spiritual unity, but not biological unity. So the Catholic RSV will have, while he was still speaking to the people, behold, his mother, Mary, and his brethren stood outside asking to speak to him. Now the brethren, what they mean by the brethren are the same as the brothers. It's the same people. James, one of his brothers, Jude, one of his brothers, or brethren, whatever you want to call them. Same people involved. But the Catholics would say a different relationship. They are not the sons of Mary. So brethren in the Roman Catholic RSV is intended to tone down brothers in Matthew 12:46 and 48. And then also, Roman Catholic RSV has a footnote here on this passage, which makes room for him having no full brothers at all. In case brethren doesn't water down or tone down brother enough, then they have a footnote which makes room for Jesus having no full brothers at all. And you know, there are basically two different theories. These are either half-brothers or cousins. Jerome espoused one of those views back in the early centuries, and the Roman Catholics picked that up. Either these are sons of Joseph by an earlier marriage, or these are cousins of Jesus. And you see, no one would ever have needed to come up with those alternatives if you weren't trying to maintain the perpetual virginity of Mary. So you've already got that dogma in your mind, so you've got to find a way to get around these things. An obvious reading of the New Testament would say that Mary and Joseph were married after the time of Jesus here and produced their own children. Joseph was not married earlier. Jesus does have cousins in the New Testament, but these are not his cousins, these are his full brothers. Only if you have a problem with ruling out perpetual virginity with Mary would you want to change this, as they've done in Matthew 12. Another change in the Roman Catholic RSV is on Matthew 16, verses 18 to 19. Turn over here and you tell me what you think they might do here. By the way, they don't change the passage, because the passage in any Protestant Bible is strong enough. But they certainly throw in their Roman Catholic theological note, though. Matthew 16, beginning with verse 18. I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. The powers of death shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. What do you think the Roman Catholic note concerns itself with on Matthew 16, 18 to 19? All right, yes, the papacy, the Holy See of Rome. The primacy of Peter. Peter is the first Roman bishop. The primacy of the Roman See, or bishopric, versus that of all the other cities of the Mediterranean world. Peter is the first pope. Apostolic succession. The inviolability of the word of the Roman pope, and so forth. Why don't you think they have this note over on chapter 18 and verse 18? Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Why don't you think they have it here? Why did they pick chapter 16 instead of 18? It says the same thing. It's directly the same, word for word. Whatever you bind, whatever you loose. Has been, shall be, whatever we want to do, as we looked with William's translation earlier. Paraphrastic Greek, future perfect. Why not in chapter 18? Okay, number one, it doesn't start off with thou art Peter and upon this rock. Number one. Number two, though. Okay, I'm looking for something else here, though. Well, in this chapter, this statement in verse 18 is evidently said to all of the apostles. You see, if you let this statement of binding and loosing, I mean, that is a Roman Catholic Pope saying, and eventually developed in Second Vatican Council 1870 of the infallibility of the Pope when speaking ex cathedra on faith and morals. First Vatican Council 1870. Well, this paves the way for it. In Matthew 16, since he mentions Peter, since the confession is elicited from Peter's lips, then they could easily build a case on the fact that whatever is said here in Matthew 16 is said to Peter alone and to Peter's successors. Verse 19, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you, Peter, bind on earth will be bound. You, Peter, representing the papacy of the Roman Catholic Church, will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. But you see over in chapter 18, he's talking to all of the apostles there. And that really hurts the Roman Catholic view, by the way. That's the Protestant argument, the Protestant counter-argument. That nothing is particular or peculiar in the Roman Catholic interpretive sense in Matthew 16 because the exact same statement is made to all of the apostles in Matthew 18. So then, of course, you don't only have Peter as a pope, but you've got John and James and all the rest of them as popes. And you have the unlikely condition of having Judas Iscariot as one of the first popes as well. Maybe that's the one from whom all the Catholics came anyway. Was Judas Iscariot not faithful Peter? Did you have a question?
Yeah, what does a pope mean?
Well, it goes back to, we had to go back early in church history. Really, they started off as bishops, you see. And there was a bishop in Rome, there was a bishop in this city, and a bishop in that city. And Paul writes, we read in 1 Timothy 3 there, a man that desires the office of a bishop desires a good work. But then by the 2nd century, the term has taken on something entirely different, a different meaning. By the 2nd century, you really have two different ecclesiastical offices and two only, one known as a bishop and one known as a deacon. And you read in some of the post-apostolic works, and you read about the bishops and the deacons all the time. And that's found as early as Philippians, chapter 1, verse 1. Paul's writing to the saints at Philippi, to the bishops, and to the deacons, which is an unusual verse in the New Testament, by the way, Philippians 1:1. And then because of the importance of the city of Rome in the Roman Empire, just politically speaking, as the capital of the empire, the man who becomes bishop there becomes the important bishop over all the others. And then before you know it, that develops on into the Pope. Okay, then a third change, still in Matthew, by the way. We've given you Matthew 12, Matthew 16. Now Matthew 1, I don't know why I have them in this order. Obviously I'm not going forward or backward. I'm kind of skipping around. But Matthew 1:19, and I'll let you tell me why this might have been changed. Her husband Joseph, wait till you get there, Matthew 1:19, her husband Joseph, being a just man and unwilling to put her to shame, resolved to send her away quietly. What was the change? Divorce. Well, Roman Catholics are kind of not in favor of divorce. Divorce is a no-no, at least until recent times. It historically has been a no-no for Roman Catholicism. And so to have the husband of the great Virgin Mary, the saint of saints of the Roman Catholic Church, even considering the notion of divorce, you see, he's too close to Mary to allow that to happen. For them to allow that to happen, for him to even consider the thought of divorce when he becomes her husband. So they tone that down and change divorce her to send her away. There's nothing wrong with either one of them. Divorce is fine. Legally, that's exactly what he was going to do. It would have been a divorce, even though they weren't married completely at the time. We'll study that later. It still would have been a divorce. But the Roman Catholics don't like that. So it's so strange how some false groups can have truth on some things. They have it generally for the wrong reason. But Protestants are almost in favor of divorce for any cause, anytime, anybody. And they've been so wrong in that area. Jesus said no, except for the cause of fornication, no. From the beginning it was not so. And the Roman Catholics have adamantly been against divorce for centuries and centuries. But that was to keep the church together, to keep children being birthed in the family, to keep the church growing this way, so that you've got 800 million RCs, like little happy Easter bunnies running around. You had to know what morning this tape is being preached on for that to really make any sense. Easter morning. Nothing wrong with the resurrection of our Lord. We sang about that today. He has risen from the dead. But it has been profaned with the Easter bunny and chocolate rabbits. Matthew 1:19. Mark 9:29. They simply add in the word fasting. Prayer and fasting, which is of dubious character. A fifth change, Luke 1:28. Luke 1:28. Let's see what we have here. Gabriel comes to Mary and says, "Hail, O favored one, the Lord is with you." Hail, O favored one, the Lord is with you. Now the Roman Catholics, bless their little deceived hearts, they just love that verse because it seems to really exalt and praise Mary. And I might just say, since I've come from a Protestant background, and I know that I've said this elsewhere as well, somewhere in teachings, that because of the fact Roman Catholics have unduly exalted Mary and her alleged perpetual virginity, Protestants have tended to overreact by having almost nothing to say about Mary. And of course, just because I come from a Protestant background doesn't mean that I hold to some of the overreactions of Protestantism. I think that there was something special about Mary and about the Virgin Mary. But it wasn't because of anything she had intrinsically in herself. It was because God had put grace on her life and God had chosen that young woman. But Protestants tend to never even think of Mary. All they think of is Mary's son. Well, that's where the emphasis should be, is Mary's son and not on Mary. The Catholics want to emphasize Mary too much. So the Protestants have overreacted. But I think the Protestants could probably have a thing to learn by studying a little bit about the life of Mary, the life of Joseph, and not so hastily overreacting, although I understand the overreaction. So what the Catholics want to do here is add in the phrase full of grace. You know, this is part of your Hail Mary, Mother of God, full of grace. And what they mean really by that is an intrinsic grace. See, Mary was a virgin. We all know that sex is sin, right? I mean, just about everybody has taught that, Catholics and Protestants, for years. So you've got to keep Mary away from that sin, even it's sin in marriage. So you keep her a virgin all of her life, because sex is sin. And being born a human being is sin, so you have to get her immaculately conceived. The Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary, who was miraculously assumed. And before you know it, you've got a little toy doll on your hands with all of these later notions which have been ascribed to her, some of them as late as the year 1950. Now, the KJV has something about Hail, thou art highly favored, and you've got some marginal readings that speak of grace. It doesn't matter how you translate it. You could say something about grace or gracious or graciousness as long as we understand that it's all from God. Grace flows in one direction, and that is from heaven to earth. Mary could never have had grace in herself, born with it, or she got it because of her own good works, or her Immaculate Conception, or because of her desire for lifelong virginity. The RSV Protestants is okay, Hail, O favored one. And by the way, I mean, that says enough. That's a fairly high statement right there. Catholics want to get in there and say, Hail, O favored one and full of grace, to make sure we've got everything ascribed to Mary that we can. And Protestants, not only do they not like this "O full of grace" business, they don't even like "O favored one." O favored one. But that's what Gabriel said to Mary, "O favored one." Protestants need to realize that. "O favored one." He didn't come to someone else and say that. He came to Mary. He said, "Hail, O favored one." Hail, thou art highly favored. You want to put in full of grace? Okay, but God has given her grace and it's not of herself. But the Catholics just add that in because it adds more to the feminine mystique of the Virgin Mary. Another change, they restored Mark 16 and John 8 to the text, which the earliest RSV had simply placed in a footnote. Now the later RSVs have followed suit and they put Mark 16 and John 8 back in the text. Those are just two passages that are so debatable that nobody seems to be able to come up with final conclusions on those. That's why it's best to just leave them there, but also study other scripture along with them, because no one seems to come to a conclusion. Even those that are great textual critics that are busy taking things out of the Bible, they hesitate really taking Mark 16 and John 8 out. They'll change a lot of other things quickly, like 1 John 5, the heavenly witness passage. But these two, it's difficult just to say no, definitely no. They're not supported in the earliest and best manuscripts, and that's about all you can say. Starting with the second major edition of the RSV New Testament in 1971. I know these are put back into the Protestant RSV. And then one other change in the Roman Catholic RSV is, of course, the placing of the apocryphal books. In an appendix? Well, no, not for a Roman Catholic Bible. They are scattered throughout the Old Testament to make them look like, because Catholics feel they are, actually part of the canonical Old Testament. Then a fourth RSV edition, and I think I'm going to have to stop with this. I've got really one more to do, number 5. We'll start that, finish that next time, and then begin looking some at Knox. But a fourth is called the Common Bible, 1973. See, I'm kind of jumping ahead in dates because I'm just adding everything that relates to the RSV we're going to study right here. We're even going to look at a study Bible next time that we would normally put with study Bibles, but because it's so closely related to the RSV, I want to study anything this closely related to the RSV with the RSV study itself. The Common Bible, 1973. Its name says it all. It's one edition of the RSV that's acceptable to Protestants, Roman Catholics, and Eastern Orthodox. It covers all three major branches of Christendom. The Common Bible. So we can have it in common, all branches of modern Christendom. Protestantism, Roman Catholicism, and the Eastern Orthodox people. The Apocrypha is placed in the first appendix after the Old Testament. Now, placing it there does what? Well, that satisfies Protestants, so they can use the Common Bible because you didn't include it in the Bible. It's not scattered throughout the Old Testament. That will satisfy Roman Catholics. They would rather have it in the Old Testament, but it will satisfy them because at least you get the Apocrypha within the front and back cover of what you call the Holy Bible. Then in the second appendix, we have 1st and 2nd Esdras and the Prayer of Manasseh. Remember, those are the 3 books that the Roman Catholics don't accept of the apocryphal works. And that second appendix then makes this Common Bible agreeable with the Eastern Orthodox folk, because they accept 1st and 2nd Esdras and the Prayer of Manasseh. So these 2 appendices to the Old Testament make the whole Bible agreeable to all of modern Christendom: Protestants, Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox. Let me just put one other thing here at the end of your notes. I meant for it to come at the very end of RSV, and since the next tape will probably be entitled, Knox's translation, then you won't know that the very, very conclusion to all that I was going to say about the RSV will be on that tape instead of on this third and last one with the RSV. So let me just say this, because I'd like this to be at the very end of what, when people see the tape list, they would think of as tapes that cover the RSV. The popularity of the RSV may finally be seen in its widespread use in commentaries. Commentaries generally don't ask the contributors, the authors, to make their own translation, but they'll use an existing translation. And so if you've got a whole lot of different commentaries using the RSV, that shows its great popularity. And so here I've jotted down from my own collection and study, my library, some of the major commentaries that use the RSV text. The Interpreter's Bible. Most of these are very, very well-known, important commentary sets. Not necessarily recommended by me, but important ones. The Interpreter's Bible, the Torch, T-O-R-C-H, the Torch Bible Commentary, Peake's Commentary, P-E-A-K-E, he was an English writer. Peake's Commentary, second edition, not the first one. That was another, I think KJV. Peake's came out a long time ago when RSV wasn't available. So some of these you have to go to a later edition before they pick up the RSV. Peake's Commentary, second edition. The New Bible Commentary, which is a reliable commentary, second edition. Broadman Commentary. Broadman, that's the Southern Baptist accepted commentary set, 12 volumes. Most of these are multi-volumes. Peake's is only one. Broadman Commentary, Living Word Bible Commentary, the Century Bible, and finally the original edition of the Interpreter's Bible Commentary. Now that's not the same as the first thing I gave you, the Interpreter's Bible. Those are two different sets.